No engine had run on this ship in 50 years. She bought the steamship and found a shocking secret. What would you do if the only thing left to your name was $22.50, and a steamboat that hadn't turned an engine in half a century? For Josephine Calloway, 19 years old and newly orphaned, this was not a riddle. It was Tuesday afternoon in a lawyer's office that smelled of dust and cold coffee. Her uncle called the wreck the Iron Swan, and he said the name the way a man says the name of a dead dog he never liked. The whole town of Miller's Landing agreed with him. Bankrotten, keel cracked, worthless. That was the verdict on the old paddlewheeler moored and sinking at Widow's Bend, and nobody in 3 counties would give $1 for her. But something had been sealed inside that hull 50 years before, something the river had never found and the scrap men never guessed at. A secret that would change the course of Josephine's life, and quietly settle a debt the whole town had forgotten it owed. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Josephine's father, Thomas Calloway, had been a steam engineer on the Coldwater River for 30 years, and there was not a boiler on that water he could not read like scripture. He taught his daughter the way some fathers teach hunting or scripture of their own, patiently, and without ever once suggesting that a girl's hands weren't suited to grease and iron. By the time Josephine was 12, she could tell a healthy gauge glass from a failing one by the way the water trembled inside it. By 14, she knew the difference between a safety valve that whispered and one that screamed, and why you never, ever wanted to hear the second kind. Thomas taught her to walk a firebox floor and feel for soft brick through the soles of her boots. He taught her the language of steam, flues and headers, packing glands and mud drums, the low complaining sigh of a cylinder waking up cold on a winter morning. An engine doesn't lie to you, Josie girl, he told her once, wiping his hands on a rag as black as a crow's wing. It only ever tells you exactly what it needs. Men lie. Ledgers lie. Steel and steam never do. He gave her one thing that had been his own father's, a small brass wrench, no longer than her hand, its jaws worn smooth from 40 years of use. He called it his listening wrench, because more than turning bolts, he used it to rap gently on boiler plates and listen to what came back. A dull knock meant sound iron. A ringing knock meant trouble hiding just under the paint. Tap first, trust second, he used to say. Josephine wore it on a leather cord around her neck from the day he gave it to her, tucked beneath her collar where it rode warm against her collarbone, and she never once, in 19 years, took it off. She did not know yet that it would open more than boilers. Thomas Calloway died on a February morning of a fever that came on fast and left just as fast, taking him with it, and Josephine found herself, at 19, the ward of her father's older brother, a man named Silas Calloway who ran a dry goods concern 2 streets back from the levee and thought of every relationship, blood or otherwise, in terms of columns and totals. Silas was not cruel in any way the law could touch. He never raised a hand, never raised his voice. He simply looked at Josephine the way he looked at slow-moving stock, as an entry that needed clearing off his books. For 11 months she lived above the store, sleeping in a room that had once held flour sacks, doing the account-keeping in exchange for her board, and watching herself shrink a little more each week into something smaller and quieter than she had been on the river with her father. Nobody in that house asked what she wanted. Nobody had to. Silas Calloway had already decided. The end came on a Tuesday, in the lawyer's office, with a green ledger open on the desk between them like a verdict already written. Thomas Calloway's estate, once debts and back rent were subtracted, came to $22.50. There was one asset left unaccounted for, a half-share in a derelict steamboat, the Iron Swan, sunk to her guardrails in the mud at Widow's Bend, her engine silent since a boiler failure in the spring of 1837, 50 years gone. No buyer in Miller's Landing wanted a wrecked boat with a dead man's curse of bad luck hanging off her stack. Silas slid the $22.50 across the desk, along with a bill of sale for the boat's other half, and said the words as flatly as a man closing a drawer. "This settles the account, Josephine. I've done my duty by my brother's memory. What you do from here is your own business." She did not cry. She did not argue. She folded the money into her father's old coin purse, signed her name to the bill of sale for a wreck nobody else would touch, and went upstairs to pack. Into a canvas bag went 2 dresses, a good pair of boots, her father's engineering journal, a small tin of tools, and, at the very bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, the listening wrench, still warm from her own skin. By dawn, she was on the road out of Miller's Landing, and she did not look back at the store even once. The stage to Widow's Bend took the better part of 2 days, 41 miles of road that grew rougher and lonelier with every mile, the tidy fences and white church steeples of town giving way to scrub pine, then to cypress swamp, then to a flat gray country where the river itself seemed to be the only thing still awake. On the second morning, the driver, a leathery man named Coop who'd hauled that route for 20 years, finally asked her outright what business a girl her age had going out to Widow's Bend alone. "I bought a boat," she told him. Coop laughed, not unkindly, but the way a man laughs at a joke he's certain is a joke. "You mean you bought a boat's ghost, miss? Ain't nothing out there but rust and river rats. Iron Swan's been sitting in that mud since before I was born. Old Thorne died right there aboard her, all alone, and folks say she's been cursed ever since. You sure your kin didn't play a trick on you?" Josephine only asked him to keep driving. They came around the last bend at midday, and there she was, the Iron Swan, listing hard to port, her paddle wheel half collapsed into the shallows, her twin stacks streaked black and orange with 50 years of rust, her pilot-house windows long since broken out by weather and boys with rocks. Vines had climbed one whole side of the hull. A pair of herons stood on the sagging Texas deck as if they, and not any human being, held the deed. She was, by any sane measure, worthless. Josephine climbed down from the stage, set her bag on the muddy bank, and looked up at that wreck for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, to no one but herself and the boat, "Well, let's see what you've got." The first month nearly broke her, and there is no honest way to tell this story without admitting that plainly. The Iron Swan had 50 years of neglect layered into her like sediment. Josephine spent her first 3 nights sleeping in the pilot-house wrapped in a horse blanket, because the cabins below were thick with mold and the smell of standing water. She bailed the lower hold by bucket for 11 straight days before she trusted the bilge enough to try patching it. Her hands, soft from a year of ledger work, split and blistered and then, slowly, began to callous over into something closer to her father's hands than her own. There were nights she sat on the sagging deck with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the swamp noise all around her, and let herself wonder, just for a moment, whether Silas Calloway hadn't done her a kindness after all by sending her someplace so far from anyone that no one would see her fail. The boat groaned under her in the current, an old, tired sound, like something breathing in its sleep. It would have been easy, in those low hours, to believe the wreck had already won. It was in that first hard month that she met the man the town called Pap Voss, an old riverman, half-blind in one eye, who lived alone in a cabin a half-mile upstream, and came down most evenings to smoke his pipe on the bank and watch her work without ever once offering to help. He didn't say much. But one evening, as she scraped rust from a stanchion with the last of her strength, he took the pipe from his mouth and said, in a voice like gravel settling, "That boat ain't dead, girl. She's just been holding her breath a long, long while." Josephine didn't understand what he meant. She thanked him for the thought, the way you thank an old man for a kindness that doesn't quite make sense, and went back to scraping rust. She would think of that sentence again many weeks later, and it would not sound strange to her anymore. It would sound like the truest thing anyone in Widow's Bend had said to her. The clue, when it came from her father, though he had been 6 months in the ground. She had been working her way through the engine room by lamplight, cataloging what could be saved and what couldn't, when she found herself standing at the boiler casing, running her palm along the riveted iron the way she'd seen her father do 1,000 times. Without quite deciding to, she reached beneath her collar, drew out the listening wrench, and tapped the plating the way he'd taught her. Dull knock, dull knock, dull knock, moving along the seam, and then, near the base of the boiler shielding, behind where the coal bunker had once stood, a knock that rang instead of thudded. She stopped, tapped it again. The same high, hollow ring. "Tap first, trust second," her father's voice said, as clear in her memory as if he stood beside her in that rusted room. A hollow ring in solid-looking ironwork meant one thing and one thing only in the language he'd taught her. There was nothing behind that plate but air. Something had been built there, deliberately, carefully, that was never meant to be structural at all. It was meant to look like part of the boiler casing, and nothing more. Josephine knelt in the mud and rust of that engine room with her lamp guttering and her heart going hard and fast against her ribs, and she understood, for the first time since she'd stepped off Coop's stage wagon, exactly why an old man on the riverbank had told her the boat was only holding her breath. What was it holding in? And more importantly, could she trust her own hands enough to find out? She worked at that seam for 4 days before she broke through, and if you have never freed rusted iron rivets from 50-year-old plating with nothing but a cold chisel, a mallet, and your own 2 hands, then understand that this was not romantic work. It was brutal, patient, deafening labor. She built a small fire in the cleaned-out firebox each morning to warm the metal and make it less brittle, the way her father had taught her to do before any major repair, and she worked the chisel along the seam a 1/4 inch at a time, tapping each rivet head until it sheared, catching each one in her palm so it wouldn't roll away into the bilge. Her shoulders screamed. Her palms split open again and bled through the calluses she'd only just grown. Twice she had to stop and re-wrap her hands in strips torn from an old shirt. On the 4th evening, with 11 rivets freed and only 3 remaining, she braced her boot against the boiler housing, gripped the edge of the plate with both hands, and pulled. The plate did not want to move. 50 years of rust had welded it half shut, and for a moment she thought she'd have to abandon it and find another way in, or accept that she'd spent 4 days chasing an old man's riddle and a hollow sound for nothing. Then, with a groan of protesting metal that she felt in her back teeth, the plate gave, swung outward on a hinge someone had built into it on purpose, a hinge disguised so well beneath rust and paint that she never would have found it without the sound leading her there. Cold, still air rolled out to meet her, air that had not moved in half a century. She lifted her lamp and looked into a space no wider than a closet and no taller than a man standing. A chamber built into the dead space between the boiler shielding and the outer hull, framed in ship's timber, dry as a bone despite everything the river had done to the rest of the vessel outside it. And there, waiting in that darkness the way a held breath waits to be let out, was everything Elias Thorne had left behind. There was an iron strongbox, its lock long since given up to rust, its lid loose enough to lift with 2 fingers. There were tools, a boilermaker's kit, every piece oiled and wrapped in oilcloth as though its owner had expected to come back and use it again. There was a leather-bound logbook, the handwriting inside gone brown but perfectly legible. And tucked into a niche carved directly into the timber frame, small enough to fit in one palm, was a carved wooden swan, its wings folded, its neck bowed, worn smooth in places as though a child's thumb had rubbed it for luck 1,000 times. Josephine set her lamp down carefully and opened the strongbox first, because her hands were shaking too badly to trust them with anything more delicate. Inside, packed in neat rows and wrapped in oiled cloth, were gold eagles, 312 of them. She would count later, twice, to be certain, along with a folded sheet of paper, sealed with wax gone brittle with age, addressed in a strong, careful hand. To whoever finds this. She sat down on the floor of that hidden chamber with the letter in her lap for a long moment before she could bring herself to break the seal. When she finally did, unfolding paper that crackled like dry leaves, this is what she read. To whoever finds this. My name was Elias Thorne, and for 11 years I kept the boilers of the Iron Swan running true, from her maiden voyage to her last. I write this in the spring of 1837, alone aboard her, with a fever in my chest that I do not expect to survive, and I mean to leave this account honest, because a dishonest man has no business asking anything of a stranger. The Widows' Bend Steam Company, which owned this vessel, failed in the winter of 1836, and in failing, it left 11 men, deckhands, firemen, a pilot, a cook, unpaid for 4 months' wages, myself among them. The company's owners scattered to the cities with what money remained and left the rest of us to whatever we could scrape together. I had a little put by, and I sold what land I owned near Cane Ridge, and over the winter I gathered enough, coin by coin, to make every one of those men whole. I built this chamber with my own hands to keep it safe until I could find them scattered along the river and pay each debt myself, man by man, the way debts are meant to be paid, in full and to the person owed. The fever took me before I could finish that work. I do not know now if I will live to see another week. If you are reading this, then I did not, and the debt I meant to settle myself has fallen instead to whoever was patient enough, and skilled enough, and stubborn enough, to find where I hid it. I had a son once. His name was Henry, and he loved this old boat better than any boy ever loved anything, and he carved that little swan you're holding with his own hands the winter he was 9 years old, because he said the Iron Swan needed a swan of her own. He died in a boiler accident on a different vessel 3 years later, a boy of 12 doing a man's work because we needed the wage, and I have never once stopped believing that if I had taught him more carefully, or paid him less mind to hurry, he would be alive still. I tell you this not for your pity but so you will understand why I care so much that a debt be paid honestly, and why I could not rest until every man who worked beside me got what he was owed. Whoever you are, I do not know you, and I never will. But you found what I could not deliver, and that tells me something about your character already. Use it to pay what is owed. See that no one goes without who has earned better. And if you have it in you, make this old ship live again. She deserves better than to rot quietly and be forgotten, same as any of us do. With gratitude I cannot properly express. Elias Thorne. Josephine read the letter twice through by lamplight, and when she was finished, she did not weep, though her throat ached with the effort of not weeping. She sat for a long while with the carved swan in one hand and her father's listening wrench in the other, and thought about two men, 50 years apart, who had each tried in their own quiet way to leave something honest behind them. Then she began to think, very practically, about what came next. She could have taken the gold and left Widow's Bend that same week, bought passage to any city she liked, and never thought of the Iron Swan again. No one would have blamed her for it. No one would even have known. But that was not the choice Elias Thorne's letter asked of her, and, more than that, it was not the choice that felt like her own. She had spent a month learning this boat's bones the hard way, with her own 2 hands, and something in that work had rooted her to the place in a manner that surprised her. So instead, Josephine did something the town of Widow's Bend had not expected from the girl in the ruined boat. She went looking for debts. She found the descendants of 2 of Thorne's original crewmen still living within 20 miles, an old fireman's widow and a pilot's grown daughter, and she paid what was owed with interest calculated fair and honest, the way her father had taught her to keep a ledger clean. Word of what she'd found, and what she'd done with it, moved through the county the way river water moves, slow at first, then all at once. The help came the way Pap Voss had promised her the boat itself would, without much talk and without her having to ask for a single bit of it. Abner Reyes, a carpenter who'd walked past the wreck for years without a word to spare her, showed up one Sunday and rebuilt her gangplank without being asked, and left before she could properly thank him. Widow Constance Hale began leaving baskets of bread and dried apples on the bank twice a week, never staying long enough for conversation, as though feeding a hard-working neighbor required no explanation at all. And Otis Krantz, the town's blacksmith and sometime machinist, came down to look at the boiler one afternoon, took one long study of her repair work, and simply said, "I'll trade you labor for a look at how you've got that firebox lined," and stayed 3 weeks. By late summer, the Iron Swan had a new stack, a rebuilt paddle wheel, and a boiler that held pressure clean and true for the first time in 50 years. What would you have done, in her place, with a debt like that settled and a boat like that reborn beneath your hands? Word of Josephine's fortune reached Silas Calloway by way of a business associate who'd heard it from a man who'd heard it from Coop the stage driver, and it reached Augustus Pruitt, the shipping man who'd tried early on to buy the wreck's mooring rights out from under her for $8, not long after. Pruitt arrived first, all smiles and a new offer, 12-fold his original bid, and left within the hour when Josephine informed him, without raising her voice even slightly, that the Iron Swan was not, and never would be, for sale. Silas took longer to show his face, and when he did, it was with a lawyer's letter in hand, arguing that the estate had never been properly closed, that a half-share sold for $22.50 under duress might yet be contestable in a court that respected a guardian's rights. It was a quiet, careful piece of cruelty, dressed up in the same bloodless legal language he'd always preferred. It did not survive contact with the truth. The bill of sale was signed, witnessed, and plainly worded. The town, by then, had heard the whole of it. How he'd sent a 19-year-old girl out alone with $22 and a wreck he was certain would finish the job her grief had started. Miller's Landing was a small enough town that reputation traveled faster than any lawyer's letter, and Silas Calloway's dry goods concern began, quietly and without any confrontation at all, To lose the custom of people who no longer cared to do business with a man who treated his own brother's daughter as a closed account. He never came back to Widow's Bend again. He simply faded, the way cold things do when no one bothers to keep them warm. A year turned, and the Iron Swan turned with it. By the following spring, she ran the Widow's Bend to Miller's Landing route twice weekly, carrying mail, freight, and passengers who'd once sworn no honest boat would ever run that stretch of river again. Otis Krantz stayed on as her permanent engineer's mate, and could often be heard bragging to strangers on the dock that he'd helped fix the finest boiler on the Coldwater River, built by a girl who'd taught herself and a dead man both. Abner Reyes built her a proper dock that same year, on contract, the first paid work she'd been able to offer any of the friends who'd first helped her for nothing. Widow Hale still brought bread twice a week, though now she stayed for coffee, and the two of them had worn a kind of ritual into their Tuesday and Friday mornings that neither one of them called friendship out loud, though it plainly was. Every evening the Iron Swan came in, Josephine sounded the whistle twice before she reached the bend, a habit she'd started without meaning to, and one the townsfolk had come to listen for the way they'd once listened for church bells. On a quiet evening in early autumn, more than a year after she'd first stepped off Coop's stage wagon with a canvas bag and a coin purse holding $22.50, Josephine sat alone on the Texas deck as the sun went down orange and slow over the Coldwater River. In one hand she held her father's listening wrench, its brass worn brighter now from a full year of daily use. In the other, she held Henry Thorne's small carved swan, its wood gone soft and warm with handling. She turned them over, one after the other, in the fading light. One man had taught her to hear the truth hiding inside iron. Another man, dead 50 years before she was ever born, had trusted that whoever found his hidden debt would have the character to pay it honest. Between the two of them, without either one ever meeting the other, they had given her everything she needed to survive the year that broke her and build the life that came after it. She was 19 when they sent her away with $22.50 to her name and a boat nobody wanted. She was 20 now, and the boat's whistle carried clean across the water, and there was not a soul left in Widow's Bend who called the Iron Swan worthless. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet inheritance and hard-won trust. If you were moved by Josephine's journey, please give this video a like and share it with someone who's ever been told that what they had wasn't worth keeping. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale. We've got another story coming soon, about a locket nobody thought was worth a second look, until someone finally did. Until then, be well. And the next time somebody calls something worthless, remember, sometimes it's only ever been holding its breath.